Oh, maybe you're not playing around this time. Well, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Shall we be right back?
I'll be right here.
Pulls. What a funny guy you are.
Well, I have my little fun.
I see. It makes it all worth it, right? Oh, that's good. Well, you know, I'm from that ancestry. Galiziana.
Which, depending on where you are, it's either fancy or not fancy at all. So I had a thought.
Pity.
I had a thought for Shul, which is that maybe for the, because everything was done very well, and then there's that realization of like, oh right, when we give out the prayers for the state, the whole system breaks down. That in terms of contacts and so forth, and either we should put them under chairs.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay. I'll take that under advisement. Yes, I think you're right. We may want to eliminate it totally. Hello? Did I lose you? Hello? 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 Are we there?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
We lost David. That's what happened.
Okay. Hey, Jeffrey.
I was in conversation with him a minute ago.
Okay, and I just got lost. Where are you? Zoom. Okay.
It's weird.
Susanna, how are you related to David?
I'm his mother.
Oh,
Close relationship.
oh, terrific. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I wonder what happened to him though. He's in the building next door. Maybe I should run next door. Find out what's going on.
He lost power or something. Something
It
happened.
must be something happened. This is weird. Very weird.
Uh-huh.
Poles apart.
So you came from Galicia or your family?
No, my family.
Yeah, your family. I
My
didn't think
father.
Yeah.
And my mother was from what was known as Bessarabia.
Oh, interesting. Well, my paternal grandparents came from Western Poland, from Stasio and Opato.
Oh,
And, yeah, and my maternal grandparents, one was my maternal grandmother was born in the good old USA, and my maternal grandfather was born in Latvia. And they spoke German, and they considered themselves German Jews.
right.
So it was, you know, when my mother and father got married, it was a big deal because, you know, one Polish, one German, come on.
All right.
Okay, you're back.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, he's back. Well, we had
I'm
a
back.
conversation while you were gone, David.
So, David, I hear what you're saying, and we just may either hand them out in advance, or we may not hand them out at all.
Yeah, either one. Whatever. This is one of those moments of like, you know, best laid plans of mice and men.
Yeah, yeah.
Gay after Gly, where everything was so smooth, and then there was that like, am I supposed to take this? Am I
Supposed to touch this? Yeah.
supposed to throw this back in your face?
Right. So it's very interesting. Rabbi Liad today asked me today, is it a real Stanton minhag to sing Avinu Sheba Shemayim? And I said, do we have to do that? That sort of stretches things out a little bit. So I said, well, it was a Bodner, innovation, which we all took to. But I hear your point.
Yeah, again, I don't know that anyone's gonna. Well, let me stand corrected. It's a show. Somebody will complain, but I don't know that anybody will make any terribly serious complaints about it. So.
Correct. I think you're right.
It's an incredible tune. It's an important bracha.
See, already.
Another voice heard from.
It begins, and so it begins. All right. So let's. Speaking of beginning, let's begin. So let's start with a handy. Let's look. When people talk about sort of the feelings between Poles and Jews, as with a lot of things involving Jews, certainly a lot of it comes down to the Holocaust, right? And where the two rival narratives of the Polish nation and the Jewish nation really come together. Right? On the one hand, you have this Jewish narrative, and this is from Yisrael Katz, who is was the extremely undiplomatic foreign minister of Israel, saying this: "I am a son of Holocaust survivors, and I was born and even grew up in a community made up of Holocaust survivors. The memory of the Holocaust is something we cannot compromise. It is clear and we won't forget or forgive. In diplomacy, you try not to offend, but nobody will change the historical truth to do something like that. Poles collaborated with the Nazis. As former Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir said, they suckle anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. The Poles took part in the extermination of Jews in the Holocaust. Poland became the biggest cemetery of the Jewish people." Now, this was said in reaction to a law that was passed in Poland, which, as you see over here, whoever claims publicly and contrary to the fact that the Polish nation or the Republic of Poland is responsible or co-responsible for Nazi crimes committed by the Third Reich, as specified in Article 6 of the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, blah, 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 or for other felonies, shall be liable to a fine or imprisonment for up to 3 years. And, if the act specified is committed unintentionally, the perpetrator should be liable to a fine or restriction of liberty, right? No offense is committed if it's committed in the course of one's artistic or academic activity, whatever it may be. So, obviously, last year, 2 years ago, Poland, which, again, is extraordinarily sensitive to the insinuation that they have responsibility for the Holocaust, passed this law. And I remember, like sort of the foundations of it when Obama had made a reference to Polish death camps, which he meant simply death camps on Polish soil, perfectly reasonable. But, for Poland, this was seen as a tremendous slur. So what I want to do today is look a bit at, what actually happened in Poland between Jews and Poles during the Holocaust, keeping in mind that it's an hour-long class. So without question, some things will not be addressed. Some things will be addressed very generally. But at least I can provide some kind of foundation here. So let's begin with this question. In which countries did Jews have the highest survival rates during the Holocaust? Anyone want to throw out a couple of names?
The Scandinavian countries?
We got some Scandinavian countries.
Denmark.
Denmark. Anyone else?
France.
France. Okay. Okay. Well, let's look at some of these numbers. These are all
Italy.
pretty accurate, with the exception of Luxembourg. I'm not sure what's going on there, but if you look at this, yeah, you see France 26%, Italy 20%, Finland right 1%. These are the percentage of Jews killed. Bulgaria 0%, Romania 50%. Now some of these, again, Russia was not really occupied, right? Just the Germans did advance there, but yeah, Denmark 1%, Norway 41%. So as opposed to, again, countries That's the Baltic countries upwards of 90%, Belgium, Netherlands 60, 75%, Poland 90%. So the question here is, what did those countries where the numbers, let's say, tend to be lower, let's call it 50% or lower, tend to have in common?
Well, some of them collaborated with the Nazis.
Ah, okay. Well, so this is where things get a little counterintuitive, right? But as a rule, the closer a country was politically to the Third Reich, right, the higher percentage of Jews survived, right? Another way of looking at it is autonomy, right? The more autonomy a country had, which generally came out of the degree to which it was needed by the Third Reich, the higher percentage of Jews that were survived. So you look at France, right? 26% of Jews were killed. Well, again, those tended to be foreign Jews, right? Generally, in all these countries, there were certain groups of Jews who were seen, let's say, as privileged, right? In France, the Jews who were deported tended to be fairly recent immigrants, refugees. In Hungary, where, again, ultimately a large percent of Jews died, but only in 1944 when the Third Reich took over, right? Meaning that up till July 1944, then Hungarians weren't deporting their Jews despite requests by the Germans. Italy, there were no deportations until 1943 when, again, Germany took over. Bulgaria, which is famous for saving its own Jews, deported some 15,000 Jews from the occupied zones of Greece and Yugoslavia. So as a rule, as long as you lived in a country which was allied with Germany in some way, you were protected. Didn't mean that you didn't have a tough time, right? Hungary placed Jews in labor battalions and so forth, various restrictions in Italy and whatnot. Didn't mean that there was no discrimination or persecution, although in Finland there was not. Finland's story is fascinating, where you actually had Finnish soldiers serving in the Finnish military, praying in field synagogues not far from the German military. Yeah, basically, the place where Jews survived was the places where the governments still had a say in what happened to their people, which, of course, brings us to Poland. And as we noted, Poland was born in World War I. It was born in discontent and resentment. It was born in the Civil War after World War I. And, surrounded by Germany and Russia. Now, contrary to, again, popular misconception, Hitler did not take power saying he's going to destroy Poland. In fact, just the opposite. Hitler was actually a dove when it came to Poland through much of the 1930s, right? Most of Germany's political parties wanted territorial revisions for Poland or wanted Poland destroyed. Hitler had actually signed a non-aggression pact with Poland, and through much of the 1930s had actually hoped to cultivate Poland as an ally against the Soviet Union. But in 1938, and even by the way in 38, when he took over, the Sudetenland, he allowed Poland to take over part of Czechoslovakia as well, right? Poland, which again depicts itself as the great victim, was also a perpetrator, when it could be. In March of 1939, this all changes. In March of 1939, Hitler takes over the rest of Czechoslovakia, creates a puppet Slovakian state, and begins to turn its attentions to Poland and to Danzig and the so-called Polish corridor. And Poland, again, not particularly trusting of Germany. The English and French, having betrayed by Hitler, form some sort of alliance together. So up until, let's say, the beginning of 1939, the Germans tried to cultivate actually fairly good relations with Poland in hopes to make some sort of alliance with them. The Soviets, for their part, had spent the 1930s looking for ways to make a territorial revision against Poland. And you have this critical period in the summer of 1939 where the English and French send diplomats to the Soviet Union to try and arrange an alliance with them. And it becomes very clear that they can't give the Soviets what the Soviets want. The Soviets want territorial revision against Poland. The Poles won't agree to it. The English and French can't offer it. And then the Germans come along and say, hey, we can make this happen. And that's really part of the big story behind the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. So September 1st, Germany invades Poland. On September 17th, the USSR invades it from the east. And from that point on, basically, Poland and its citizens, their fate is basically in the hands of the Soviets and the Germans. And it's very important for understanding the history we're going to talk about, that there was no Polish regime operating in Poland during the war. And this becomes part of Poland's own mythology, right? That they brag that they didn't create a collaborationist regime as many countries did. The truth is that while, again, the Germans had toyed with the idea before September 17th, 1939, once the Soviets invade, there's no more point or reason to have any sort of collaborationist regime in Poland, right? There were Poles who were ready to collaborate, right? The end result is that, right, the fact that there was no Polish collaborationist regime isn't because they couldn't find Poles willing to do it. It's because the Germans simply saw no value to it and didn't pursue it. The end result, though, is the same, right? That in many countries, there was some sort of national officialdom that collaborated with the final solution. In Poland, there was none, because there was no functioning national authority, right? There were local authorities that sometimes did. There were mayors, there were local police forces and so forth that assisted the Germans. But when we talk about Poland, the only Polish regime during the war was the Polish government in exile operating in France and then Britain, which most certainly was not collaborating in the final solution. Now, under both occupations, there were efforts made to integrate Poland, if not Poles, into the new states. And I love this map, which is, granted a fairly, let's say nerdy thing for me to say, but I love this map because it really breaks down how Poland was to be divided, right? The Soviets come in the east, and they say, okay, we're going to integrate these parts of Poland into pre-existing political entities, right? Ukrainian Poland, let's say, will be integrated into Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Belarusian part into the Belarusian Republic. The Soviets are very generous at this point, and they give parts of this territory to Lithuania. Right, Lithuania was still an independent country. The Soviets give them Vilna as a little gift. Again, they're not terribly generous because they're going to take over all of Lithuania the next year. But they integrate that stuff. The Germans, for their part, in some cases, extend pre-existing German provinces. Right? If you look up there, East Prussia, that gets bigger. But they take certain territories of Poland and create new gaus or districts out of them, right? And then there's this area here, the general government, which is kept sort of as a buffer between the Soviet Union and Germany. It's under German control. But that's where they're, at least for the meantime, planning to place both Jews and Poles, right? And that's, as we're going to see, important to understand. In 1939 and 1940, it is not necessarily worse to be a Jew in German-occupied Poland than to be a Pole, right? It wasn't necessarily better either. But keep in mind, the final solution at this point was still largely some form of mass immigration or expulsion. And maybe in the future, I'll do a class on sort of the development of the final solution and some of the historiography behind that. But at this point, the Jews in Poland to the Germans were a short-term problem. Not short-term because they're going to be exterminated, but short-term because the assumption is when this war is over, we're going to kick them out. And so we don't have to deal with them, right? We just have to stockpile them somewhere until that happens. The Poles are something else, right? There are a lot more Poles, and they're in the way, right? The Germans, Hitler had promised the Germans Lebensraum, right, living space, and Poles, you got to figure out what to do with them. And in terms of what to do with them, fascinating memo, secret memo written by Himmler in 1940 that outlines, sort of vaguely what their ideas were. It's called Some Thoughts on the Treatment of the Alien Population in the East. Okay, I hope that the concepts of Jews will be completely extinguished with the possibility of a large immigration of all Jews to Africa or some other colony. So understand, this is a secret memo. So this is actual, like, his thinking process. It's not like this is for public consumption and they're hiding, extermination, right? Kick the Jews out somewhere. For the non-German population of the East, there must be no higher school than the 4th grade elementary school. The sole goal of this school is to be simply arithmetic up to 500 at the most, writing of one's name, the doctrine that it is a divine law to obey the Germans and to be honest, industrious, and good. I don't think that reading is necessary of a people, right? That the basic idea here, and this fits in later on again when we talk about, again, I'll do a class on the final solution and we'll talk about some of the things there, is that a large part of the Slavic population, and again, I want to point out, Hitler was not like the rabid anti-Slav he's often made out to be. The Slavs themselves fit into different categories for him. But a large part of the population in what Germany called the East was going to die, and the remainder would become essentially serfs for this expansive German state, right? So many Poles would die, and the Poles who survive would become this essentially enserfed population, barely educated, indoctrinated to serve the Germans. Those Poles who were found to be racially of good stock, again, whole other discussion, could be Germanized, and again, discussion for something else. So Germany annexed outright, again, these territories that you see here in the purple, that contained about 8 million Poles and 600,000 Jews. So right off the bat, that gives you some idea of the scope of these problems, right? 600,000 versus 8 million. Ultimately, all the Jews and a large percentage of Poles had to be removed from that purple area, because that was going to be incorporated into the Reich itself, right? That removal would either be by death or expulsion into the general government. And it's worth pointing out that the Einsatzgruppen, right, the special action groups, which later on are going to kill 1.5 million or so Jews in the Soviet Union, begin operating in Poland in 1939, targeting primarily not Jews, but the Polish elites. Again, in keeping with Germany's plan for Poland, that they're going to be this sort of subservient population. And it's interesting to think, again, given the large Catholic population of Germany at the time, large numbers of Catholic priests are sent to concentration camps or murdered outright. Intellectual elites, aristocrats, political elites, all are targeted. By the end of 1939, reasonable estimates suggest about 40,000 Poles have been killed by Germans. And this continues through 1940. And it's worth noting here, part of the Jewish myth about Poland that I've heard a lot is that, why did the Germans set up the death in Poland? Well, because the Poles are such. Right? The reality is, and we'll see this more clearly later on, Germans didn't care what Poles thought. Right? There's no evidence that Germans gave any consideration to what role Poles would play in the final solution, because they weren't given a role in the final solution. And again, their opinions were not solicited about any of this stuff. By the time of Germany's invasion of the USSR, so end of June 1941, perhaps 200,000 Poles died in their occupation, maybe 100,000 Jews. Again, it's one of those counterfactual, what differently in the USSR, but yeah, look, it's not inconceivable that you might have had an end result in which 2 million Jews died and then the rest were expelled, while 6 million Poles or 7 million Poles ended up dying, right? By 1941, this begins to shift for various reasons, but it's interesting to look at the food rationing taking place in Warsaw in 1941, right? And it gives you, again, some sense of why you have, or how you have, these two extremely powerful national mythologies that can't seem to exist together. The average daily ration in 1941 for Jews in Warsaw Ghetto was 184 calories, compared to 699 calories for the Poles, right? Now, obviously, from the Jewish perspective, we're going to say, well, look at that. The Poles were getting 3 times as much as Jews. right? The recommended daily allowance is 2,000 to 2,500 calories. So yeah, while the Poles in Warsaw were, living large by Jewish standards, it doesn't say much for Poles' long-term prospects, right? For various reasons, again, the Poles at this point are not being starved the way the Jews are being starved, but they are being starved. Right. Now, let's turn our attention now to what happens in Soviet-occupied Poland, where the relationship between Jews and Poles is further complicated by the relationship between Poles and other local nationalities. So, look, when the USSR invades, it doesn't call itself an invader; it calls itself a liberator. It sells itself as saying, "Oh, Germany invaded Poland. We're going to step in to liberate and protect the Slavic nationalities of the East." Protecting them not only from the Germans, but from the Poles, who, as we discussed last week, had spent the previous 20 years repressing these nationalities. And by all accounts, not only Jews, but many Ukrainians and Belarusians welcomed the Red Army. They did see the Soviets, in many cases, as benefactors and protectors from the Poles, who saw now an opportunity to overturn the order of things that they'd suffered under. And fun little fact here, again, when we talk now about Jews and communism, as a rule, electoral support for communism, not necessarily party membership, but electoral support in Eastern Europe during the interwar period correlates very strongly to ethnic marginalization, right? That when you go from country to country, the communist parties get most of their votes from not based on class, right, but based on ethnic groups that were marginalized by the Paris peace agreements, right? And it comes out in funny ways. For example, in Hungary, where Jews were the main sort of supporters of communism and were also the main minority, the majority Hungarians were extremely anti-communist. In Slovakia, or Czechoslovakia, but the Slovak part of it, the Hungarian minority was the main supporter of communism, right? Meaning the only difference between these groups being that in one case, the Hungarians were a majority, in one case, a minority. And you see in the 1920s, actually, yeah, Jews supported communism, certainly voted for communism, but higher percentages of Ukrainians and Belarusians supported communist parties than Jews did. And it's also worth pointing out here that in the 1930s, while most members of the various communist parties in Eastern Europe weren't Jews, and most Jews weren't members of the communist parties, a disproportionately large share of party membership, an even higher percentage of party leadership were Jews in Poland, which was the case in most of Eastern European communist parties, right? So in Poland, again, Poles don't like to talk about this because it's part of their mythology, a higher percentage of Poles than Jews were party members. But if Jews were, let's say, 10 to 11% of the population, they were maybe 25 at most percent of the Polish Communist Party. And in the youth movements, even higher. So, and briefly, actually, a majority of the youth movement. So, yeah, most Jews weren't communists, most communists weren't Poles, but certainly Jews were disproportionately factored, and again, particularly at the leadership level. And again, in a country like Poland, not going to be surprising that they're going to single out Jews for this stuff. So look, when the Soviet tanks roll in, lots of Polish citizens welcome them as liberators, right? Jews do, Ukrainians do, Belarusians do, and certainly many Jews saw them really as, not just, oh, well, now we can stick it to the Poles, but as certainly preferential to the Nazis. But whatever good reason they may have had, right, lots of Poles saw their fellow citizens as traitors and collaborators, and with good reasons, right? Jews did stand out both for their actual actions and the Judeo-Bolshevik stereotype, right? And look, there is lots of evidence for this, right? There's lots of accounts from Poles who lived in what's called the Kresy, K-R-E-S-Y, which is the Polish borderlands where the Ukrainians and Belarusians, Lithuanians, and Poles all sort of competed. And you can find them online, you can find them in books, where you find accounts of Jews welcoming the Red Army, of Jews joining communist militias, of Jews beating and persecuting Polish soldiers, of Jews informing on Poles who had been government officials or police officials, whatever it may be, right? There's a lot of payback here, right? Jews and Ukrainians and Belarusians who've been on the receiving end of Polish hostility are now flipping it around. And these accounts aren't just coming from the Poles. It's not, you can't just dismiss it as anti-Semitism. The bottom account here is from an NKVD, that's one of the forerunners to the KGB, speaking about the Jewish role here. Such a practice has taken root here. The Jews have supported us, and only they were always visible. It has become fashionable for the director of every institution to boast that he no longer has even a single Pole working for him. Many of us are simply afraid of the Poles. Look, the fact is that the Soviet occupiers recognized that they could trust Jews in a way that they couldn't trust Poles. They could trust Belarusians and Ukrainians too, and all these people participated. But Jews, given the fact that Jews tended to be more literate, in many cases more politically involved, right, often made very useful supporters here. At the same time, not only was this only a minority of Jews, and a small minority, but it obscured the fact that large numbers of Poles may not have publicly collaborated, right? You didn't have Poles, right, putting on armbands and joining the communist militias, but a lot of them served as informants. NKVD records in the Bialystok province, for example, showed that the vast majority of informants weren't Jews, they were Poles, which again doesn't go along with the Poles' own national myth, and not something that they really want to talk about. All right, but again, what we can say is during the Soviet occupation, a minority of Jews very publicly collaborated, while hundreds of thousands of Poles were sent to prison camps, tens of thousands of Poles were murdered, and the foundations of Polish political and cultural authority were demolished. And the same thing is going to take place, by the way, a year later in Lithuania, where again, in Lithuania, Jews were something like 30% of the Communist Party. When the Soviets take over Lithuania in the summer of 1940, the same pattern manifests, and both of these are going to be sort of responded to when the Germans invade. So what you have here is often a case, complicated relationships. It's not one truth, but several. And to me, it's interesting, again, sort of comparing this to the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis, where each side has a whole litany of very true and legitimate complaints, but it sort of all goes back to, like, well, who started it? And I would say, who cares, right? So, you could say that many of the nationalities who found themselves under Polish rule after World War I preferred some alternatives to that rule. You could say that many Poles felt that those national minorities were unreliable and disloyal and engaged in various forms of oppression. You could say when the Soviets arrived, they were welcomed by members of those nationalities, including Jews, who assisted in the persecution of Poles. And you could say that the stereotype that all Jews are Bolsheviks or all the Bolsheviks were Jews, or that they're the main prop of the new regime, were products both of actual Jewish behavior, meaning it's not out of nowhere that Jews were accused of collaborating with the communists, but it also comes out of long-standing anti-Semitic delusions about Zido Communa, right, about Judeo-Bolshevism. All these things are true. Now, all this sort of changes with the invasion of the USSR and the implementation of Operation Reinhardt, which is the extermination of Polish Jewry. And the Jews of Poland simply move up on the endangered list. And here's what we can say about the next few years, right? And we kind of flip what we saw with the Jews in 1939 and 1941, which is that the majority of Poles did not collaborate. The majority of collaborators in Poland were not Poles, but certainly a public minority of Poles did. And here's something, though, that's really important to understand Polish behavior. Poland was the only country in Europe where it was a capital crime to assist Jews, right? And this is really fascinating to me. Again, if the Germans had this notion that, oh, we should put the death camps in Poland because the Poles are such anti-Semites, certainly their policies don't suggest that, because, right, if they really trusted on Polish anti-Semitism to make them useful allies, they wouldn't have passed this rule, right? Again, death penalty for Poles who assist Jews, who provide them with lodging and food, right, as you see here, right? will be punished with death. The same penalty applies to anyone who knowingly provides refuge to such Jews, not only a night's lodging and food, but also any other aid, transporting them in a vehicle, the purchase of Jewish valuables, etc. And it's useful here to take a moment to contrast this with Denmark. What was the policy regarding aids to Jews in Denmark? Anybody know? Like when the Danes quite laudably and famously rescued their Jewish population, they weren't actually breaking any laws, right? Denmark was only occupied by Germany. It still had its own government, right? The Germans set up a protectorate there, but Danish law was still in force. Right, there was no penalty for assisting Jews. There was no penalty for hiding Jews. None of that stuff. And leaving aside the question of where Polish Jews going to go on as opposed to the Danes who can just bring them to Sweden, right? The reality is that the people of Poland, let's say Poles, were confronted with decisions when it came to rescuing Jews or saving Jews or protecting Jews that nobody else in Europe was obligated to face. And this policy was enacted not just against individuals, but against entire families, in some cases, entire villages. Approximately 700 Poles were murdered by the Germans for assisting Jews. And it's worth pointing out here that, people play this numbers game. Well, how many Jews were killed and how many were informed on and how many hid them and how many saved them. All it took was one informant to murder dozens of Jews. But to hide Jews generally took entire networks of people, right? Even if you were hiding 5 Jews in your farmhouse, what that often meant was that there were people who knew that you had them. They brought the Jews there. They saw you buying more food, right? Or noticed you kept strange hours, all of these things, right? And if you look at the accounts of Jews who were saved, in fact, many of them will point out that, yeah, there were other people involved, right? They moved from place to place, people bought food, people bought information, whatever it may be. It was more than just that one person there. And I think it's interesting here to take a choice here, right? Because again, I think people very likely say, well, the Poles should have done more. So look, I like to think of myself as a good person, as a virtuous person. I think that I am the sort of person who, if I had to risk my life to save others, I like to think I would do that. But I will say this. I don't know I would be comfortable risking my children's life to save strangers or even people I know. My wife's life, the lives of all the people in my building. And not only do I know I'm willing to do that, I don't know if that's the right thing to do. If you're given a choice to save 3 people, but to do so, right, puts your family at risk of being killed, which is the right thing to? I don't know. It's not a question I can answer. It's a question to think about. When we talk about what people should have done or could have done, we honor those people who made the decision. I don't know how much we should judge people. And it's interesting, again, the degree to which are sometimes counter to our idea of sort of what we would think of those people. I'm going to read you a quote here from all right. Can you not hear me? All right. I'm going to, I guess, log on and off again. So I will I'll be back in a minute. All right.
Okay, hopefully this is better.
Am I back?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, we can't see you, but you're back. Yeah, okay.
Work on that. God, you should be deprived of that. All right. So here's a again interesting set of quotes here. Right, Jews. This was written in 1936. Jews are so terribly alien to us, alien and unpleasant. They are a race apart. They irritate us and all their traits grate against their sensibilities. Their oriental impetuosity, argumentativeness, specific mode of thought, the set of their eyes, the shape of their ears, the winking of their eyelids, the line of their lips, everything. In families of mixed blood, we detect the traces of these features to the third or fourth generation and beyond. Here's this woman speaking a few years later during the war. Our feelings towards the Jews has not changed. We continue to regard them as political, economic, and ideological enemies of Poland. Moreover, we realize they hate us more than they hate the Germans, than they make us responsible for their misfortune. Why and on what basis remains a mystery of the Jewish soul. Nevertheless, this is a fact. Now, the speaker, however, continued, right, hence to say this. My lips. To say awareness of the duty of condemning the murder. Whoever remains silent, this is a separate quote, in the face of murder becomes an accomplice to that murder. Anybody know what Zagota was?
Right, that was the underground, right?
What specifically the Jewish Rescue Underground?
Yeah, I believe that Irina Sendler was a member of Zagota. Irina,
Yes.
who saved several thousand Jewish children as part of the circle.
Yes. So Irina Sendler was a member of it, but this woman, Zavia Kosek-Shutzka, was the founder of Zagota, right? Meaning that it was founded by an anti-Semite, who in fact believed that there were too many Jews in Poland and that Poland needed to rid itself of many of its Jews and Jewish influence. And it's again a curious thing for us. She was a devout anti-Semite, but she was also a devout Catholic who believed, let's say, as Cardinal Land mentioned, last week, that yes, Jews are anti-Polish and corruption and all these other things, but they're still human beings. And one finds, again, this interesting thing where people who had been members of fairly anti-Semitic political factions like Pias before the war end up aiding Jews during the war, both because, again, they were good Catholics and they shouldn't do that, but also they were Polish nationalists. And, right, whatever they might feel about Poles, right, in Poland, with the German invasion, right, they saw the Jews, let's say, as fellow Poles or fellow Polish citizens. So again, a lot of this stuff breaks down in ways we don't tend to think of. Now, in terms of the question of the armed Polish resistance groups, the behavior is guided by several factors, each of which was somewhat linked, right? So when we evaluate what the Polish resistance did or did not do. One factor is practical. The fact is that partisans in Poland were in a trickier situation than Polish partisans. They couldn't simply hide their guns and live openly in the village. Right? If you're a Polish partisan, you could live in your village and then at night go and sabotage a bridge or something like that. That was not the case for Jews. They couldn't produce food, right? Only consume it. All these things, were certainly issues for the Jewish partisans in terms of their survival, but also an issue in terms of their integration with the mainstream Polish partisan groups. The next one is a big one, long-term national military goals. Jewish partisans, quite reasonably, tended to be concerned with daily survival. Whereas in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, taking symbolic steps, right? The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was not designed to harm the German military. It was designed to make a show of, right, Jewish resistance. The Polish underground groups, though, spent this period, especially 43 and 44, concerned with the question of what happens when it's time to liberate Poland, right? We need to marshal resources. We need to stockpile weapons. We can't waste ourselves on unnecessary military actions because the fear especially is that at some point the Soviets come in and we need to be the ones to liberate Poland. Otherwise, the Soviets will take it over. Right? And finally, it's so many different claims on parts of Poland. The Soviets, the Germans, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Belarusians, all making claims in Polish territory. What would a liberated Poland consist of, right? Because at some point, it's not just fighting the Germans or fighting the Soviets. It's also fighting the various nationalist militias from these other groups as well. Thus, what at times seems like anti-Semitism on the part of Polish resistance, and again, certainly there was, again, these things are not mutually exclusive, might at times be more properly understood in this larger context. Some resistance groups were certainly hesitant to include Jews who added risk without necessarily adding value, right? For some of these groups, integrating Jews created more problems than was worth. Some resistance groups were hesitant to provide weapons which were needed for the final national struggle to Jewish groups, right? And again, I think it's interesting to look at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising versus the Warsaw Uprising, right? That in 1943, yeah, true that the Polish resistance didn't give many weapons to the Jews, but they also didn't have many weapons, and many of the weapons they had, again, they were stockpiling for what they saw as the necessary military campaign, not just a statement. The campaign-to-campaign banditry against Polish peasants would inevitably include Jews who stole in order to survive. And this, again, gets tricky. At one point, the Polish Home Army, which was the main official fighting force, issues a statement against banditry, which does, in fact, lead to Polish underground units fighting Jewish underground units. And again, it's not saying these people weren't anti-Semites, but the fact is, Jewish underground groups engage in banditry against Polish peasants. I'm not judging them. They did it because they had to survive. But from the perspective of the Polish underground, whose job was to protect against the robbery of peasants who in many cases did very little themselves, this conflict became inevitable. And then finally, as the Soviets advance into the Kresy, that border region, fighting breaks out between Jewish partisans allied with the Red Army and Polish resistance units in the Ukrainian National Forces, right? That the Soviets begin to arm the Jewish resistance groups like the Bilski partisans, and those partisans become then now an arm of the Soviet campaign against Poland in this area. So you have both things taking place. You're going to have Jewish partisans and Jews killed by the Polish underground, but you're also going to have Polish underground people hunted down, in some cases, and killed by Jewish partisans, not because of anti-Semitism or because of a fight against anti-Semitism, but because as arms of the Red Army and the NKVD, right, their task was eliminating Polish nationalist militias in this region. The conclusion, I think, would be that while there were certainly anti-Semitic resistance groups, the main group, the Home Army, behaved for the most part correctly, but not much more than that, right? I mean, we can say that it did not engage in anti-Semitic violence as a rule, and at times punished, even with execution, members of its units that did murder Jews, but it also did not necessarily see the fate of Polish Jews in the same light as it did the fate of Poland, right? And you see throughout this that, this gap remained, right? Polish Jews were part of Poland, but, and to that end, would receive certainly some support from the government, some propaganda, some military assistance, but there is still a point at which their fate was not quite seen the same as the fate of Poland itself. Yes, and look, this is a fascinating document here. So this guy, Zygmunt Klukowski, who was a Polish physician, member of the Home Army. He kept a diary through the war years under German occupation, then kept a diary under Soviet occupation for years after the war. Both books have been published. But you kind of see here in this one page, in October of 1942, I imagine, all these different elements of Polish behavior we talked about, right? That it's time for an action against the Jews of the town. It was posted the penalty for hiding Jews is death, but for showing their hiding places, special rewards will be given. So you have here the carrot and stick shown the Poles. Death for killing Jews, for saving Jews, special rewards for assisting their death. It was a terrifying day. I cannot describe everything that took place. You cannot imagine the barbarism of the Germans. I'm completely broken and cannot seem to find myself. The next day, the only difference is that the action against the Jews continues. The only difference is the SS has moved out and the job is now in the hands of our local gendarmes and the local blue police. They received orders to kill Jews and they're obeying them, right? Poles who in fact are collaborating with the murder of Jews. It is a shame to say it, but for some Polish people took part in that crime. Some people even helped the gendarmes look for hidden Jews. The Germans even killed small children. It is hard to describe. It is so horrible it is almost impossible to comprehend. Legally, the Jews don't exist in Szczebrzeszyn anymore, but still many Jews are in hiding. All will be killed sooner or later. You have here, I think, sort of this full spectrum of the Polish experience here regarding the Jews. The threat of death, the promise of survival for Poles, right, who in their own cases are, again, hungry and scared and whatnot. Collaboration. Those Poles like Klukowski, who in fact are horrified by what's happening to the Jews and do consider it barbarism. And all these speak to the Polish experience, because there's not one Polish experience, there are multiple Polish experiences, just like there are multiple Jewish experiences. And perhaps to understand these rival narratives, I mentioned at the beginning, we need to look at the myths that these narratives tap into, right? Rival myths as well. The Poles see themselves as a nation and once uniquely victimized and uniquely heroic, right? This precedes World War II, but certainly during World War II, this Polish self-perception reaches its, sort of its greatest level, right? They suffered unbearable suffering or unimaginable suffering under the Nazis. They, in many cases, did fight very heroically against both the Nazis and the Soviets. And they also suffered tremendously under the Soviets. So you have a nation with its own tremendous sense of sort of chosenness and martyrdom and heroism, which often finds itself accused by Jews of being complicit in Jewish persecution, but also finding their own suffering diminished or ignored. Right? The Poles see not only themselves and their own suffering ignored, but they see themselves cast in the role of villains. And they're not interested, for the most part, in sort of appreciating their own narrative, their own mythology. For Jews, the Holocaust ties in with all kinds of trauma and pain, including the shame of passivity, which runs through all kinds of Jewish psychological problems here. And I throw out the idea here that there is something in the Jewish psyche, which is often very reassuring to cast blame on Poles, right? Meaning that it is easier for Jews to say, why didn't the Poles stop the trains, than to say, why didn't the Jews not get on the trains? Right? We want the Poles, let's say, to have been more active in this sense than the Jews were themselves. And that may be true if, of course, the Poles had freedom of action. Less true, of course, if the Poles did not. And perhaps one lesson for all this is that Jews and Poles alike need to stop thinking in terms of the collective, right? Poles blame the Jews for collaborating with the Soviets. Jews blame the Poles for collaborating with the Germans. And I think, these are not useful ways of understanding this stuff. And I think at the same time, one certainly may raise critical questions about behaviors of even large numbers of Jews and large numbers of Poles without having to call into question the fundamental humanity of either one, right? I think that, the ideal going forward is for both groups to sort of look into their own mythologies and narratives and to understand how, these are two sides of the same coin, right? We have national myths about our own behaviors, our own suffering, and that collective experience. And we also then have national myths about the collective experience of the other, right? The collective experience of the Poles, collective experience of the Jews, and the more we can sort of move away from these collective constructs, I think the easier it'll be for Jews and Poles to sort of move into a better understanding of the Holocaust and World War II and a better understanding of one another. And with that, I end, and I'm happy to address questions or comments or concerns.
Well, of course, libraries upon libraries are filled with books dealing with all these issues. They're very, very complex. And
yeah, I want to recommend, by the way, a book called Bloodlands.
Yes.
By
yes.
Timothy Snyder.
Yes.
Yeah, have you read it, Jeff?
I know the book.
Yeah.
He lays out the thing that especially the Soviets hunger, campaign to starve the Ukrainians, and all the other fighting that took place in Eastern Europe along that line, that Eastern European line, really led to the German belief that this was all very possible to conquer, and that these were very vulnerable populations.
Well, but also in terms of understanding the tremendous violence that took place in Eastern Europe, that by the time the Germans roll in, you already have these tremendously brutalized populations, right? Who are used to being killed, who are used to killing. And while the Nazi final solution is this sort of unique phenomenon, it's able to sort of benefit in great extent from the degree of violence which sort of absorbed this whole region. Yeah. Highly recommended.
Yeah, highly. I would just say that when the Soviets came into Eastern Poland, yes, there were Jews who were pleased with that because it was better than the Nazis. But the Soviets were extremely harsh on Jewish capitalists and religious persons. And the capitalists, for the most part, were arrested and deported to Siberia. And their families then joined them in Siberia. This was a very ruthless persecution, and it should really be noted.
Yeah, well, look, it's an interesting thing. And this is, again, the nature, I'd say, look, it's interesting because, again, we find it the flip of then what happens in 42 and 43 and 44, right? Where Poles, witnessing their own suffering, are blind to what's happening to the Jews and just see the Jews as collaborators without seeing the trauma the Jews are going through. In the same way, the Jews are then going to be blind to what Poles are going through and see only their own suffering and not see, again, the trauma that the Poles are suffering and only see them as collaborators. So, and you're right. I mean,
Polish capitalists and Polish religious leaders were equally persecuted.
Well, I just mean under the Germans, right? That
under the Soviets, I'm talking about.
Yeah, correct, yes. Yeah. So in both cases, again, we sort of become prisoners of our own national mythological narratives.
Yes.
Sylvain?
Yeah, so first of all, as in the past lectures also, I think you do a great job of not only explaining many of the details, but also the overall conceptual structure of the complexity of this history and how everybody's tried to use it to set for their own national narratives, inevitably, and in particular the Jews and the Poles. I mean, of course, the Poles, as you say, the Poles keep track of the fact that something like 10% of the Polish Christian population were killed by the Germans. So it's a huge number. Of course, it doesn't compare to what the Jews suffered in percentage, but it's not trivial either to lose 10% of a nationality. There are a couple of places where there are some small differences in some points. One is, I would say that you pointed out that a significant number, there were Poles that collaborated, there were Poles that died for trying to hide Jews. I mean, it was all, everything happened. And I think slightly more Poles died for hiding Jews than the numbers you suggested.
That might very well be. I mean,
because
sorry.
When I was in Poland, I spoke to, there's actually a firm guy who is, at least when I was there about 10 years ago, I was there a number of times visiting academically, and I knew a guy named Spielmann who was a firm guy, Jewish guy, who was in charge of the memorial at Belzec, the concentration, the extermination camp there. And he told me that at Belzec alone, about 2,000 Poles were killed along with Jews for helping Jews. And as you say, that risked life for Poles and their families to help.
Yeah, I mean, the figure I got might have had to do with pacification actions.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Right. So, yeah, I'm perfectly happy to raise the number. So, yeah. So in some cases,
it wasn't only individuals, but villages.
Yeah, entire villages.
With entire villages.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And families.
One other thing, going back to the, I mean, there are many different ways to interpret what happened. I mean, the Poles and the Soviets were obviously, they had fought a war with each other in the 1920s and so on, and they were at loggerheads, and there was couldn't be any trust between them. Well, one of the issues was when the British and the French wanted to form an alliance to contain the Germans in the east with Poland, and they went to Russia. The Soviets understood, not wrongly, that there was no way to defend Poland without the Soviets coming through Poland. And there was no way that the Poles were going to allow Soviets to come through, because they distrusted the Soviets about as much as they distrusted the Germans.
With good reason.
Yeah, with reason. I mean, they had good reason, of course, yes. But they wouldn't allow the Soviets through as part of an alliance.
Yeah, this
British
actually,
and French tried to formulate.
Yeah, this actually came up even earlier in 1938,
yes,
where the Soviets had been in talks with the Czechs, with all these people, and had thrown out the idea that they would be willing to step in, but they needed this sort of carte blanche to be able to intervene in Romania or Czechoslovakia or Poland, you know, as they saw fit, which understandably none of the countries were particularly interested in conceding.
Right. One other point, the as you indicated, Polish Home Army units varied a lot in their attitude toward the Jews. Some units saved Jews, some units were hostile to Jews, and so on. It varied a lot, but mostly they behaved pretty well. Mostly, not all by any means. But the Polish government in exile in London did very sternly and repeatedly warn against Poles cooperating with the Germans against the Jews. They issued many such warnings, and they explicitly told Poles that if they collaborated with the Germans against the Jews, they would be prosecuted after the war. So the Polish government in exile, I would say, in London, its role was more limited because, after all, you know, they were in London and the situation was in Poland. But they did issue warnings.
Yeah, no, that's what I'd say.
Yeah,
no, that's what I say. I think the term, it's a bit self-serving, but I think the term correctly is a good term, right? I mean, you might be familiar with the work of David Engel. I had him as a professor years ago, who's really written literally the book on, you know, sort of the stuff. And he said, look, basically, the Polish government sort of behaved in exile, behaved about as well as any government would for a sort of, you know, a national minority in a sense, right? Meaning that
it wasn't their top priority, but they were deeply concerned about it, and they did try and get the Allies to act about it also, and they spread information about what the Germans were doing.
Quite frankly, I mean, I think that you know, sort of as a collective, let's say, no, to avoid collective, I do think that Polish concerns or Polish resentment at the way that they're often cast by Jews is really quite fair, right? I think that there's a lot of sort of Jewish mythology which is extremely anti-Polish, and there's legitimate criticisms to be made, but it often goes far beyond the legitimate criticisms, and it's often made by people who don't realize, like, you know, don't really know the history.
Yes. One last thing I would say, that one thing one might keep in mind was that the Nazis made it their business in the 1930s and during the war also, to not only stir up hatred against the Jews, but to stir up all the internecine hatreds that there could be in Eastern Europe. So they worked their propaganda, they suborned journalists, they did everything they could to increase the kind of various ethnic and national hatreds of one group against the other everywhere in Eastern Europe.
Which they then made very good use of.
Which they made use of, right. So I think that you know, it's very hard to reconstruct exactly which journalist was in the pay of the Nazis, for example. But they had this
The ones who
very
wrote about how
vicious
handsome
influence
Hitler was.
everywhere on lots of groups.
Yeah. Emo, were you going to say something?
Also,
Yeah, I was going to
lots of
say,
journalists everywhere.
okay. I was going to say that when you talk about the Polish government in exile, they sent Jan Karski,
Yes.
Belzec, and and he, you know, was with the resistance and so on. He managed to see what was going on there. He was supposed to report to international leaders about this, and I believe he even spoke to Roosevelt or to certainly high officials in the American government. Nothing was done as a result. But he was I heard him lecture many years ago. He became a professor in America. Very unusual and brave.
And also interesting, something I forgot to put into the notes here. When you look at the composition of camp guards in Poland, the Germans didn't make use of generally of ethnic Poles. They generally made use of Ukrainians, right? Meaning that even in terms of the development of the camp system in Poland, it wasn't something that they generally drew upon the Polish population for, whether for whatever reason, and some of them might be, again, their feeling that the Poles were not reliable, and certainly probably sense that the Polish underground was, you know, operating in some of these places and so forth too. But yeah, no, definitely, whether or not the Poles should have passed that law is another issue, but certainly their sense of unfairness is something.
Again, thank you so much for your wonderful lectures. They really are
That's
terrific.
really great.
Thank you for praising me. My mother online, so this is fantastic. Shep the Nachricht. I
am. What do you think?
Yeah, I know. No, next week, Tom Gedalia. So I don't know if people want to do it on Tuesday or put it off a week, or just do it. So.
Hi, Joel. Just give me a second. Just give me 1 second. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Well, I'll talk to you, Jeff, about Monday and Tom Gedalia and whether or not.
What's your topic for next week?
So next week is going to be basically the period since World War II. I mean, it's going to focus heavily on the period right after the war, some of the things going on in Jews in Poland in the period from 46 until the early 50s, Gomulka government 67, and then a little bit about the sort of weird love-hate relationship with Jews and Poland since the fall of the Soviet Union. So,
thank you. Look forward to it.
Hopefully interesting stuff. Thank you. And as somebody who's been there, you should feel free to speak up a lot next week. So, all right. Thank you. Good night.
My parents were born in Poland.
You speak Polish?
No, I don't speak Polish, unfortunately. I know a few words from childhood, but Polish was the language my parents spoke when they didn't want us to understand.
Got it. Gotcha. So when you heard Polish, you have all kinds of deep psychological PTSD.
Yes, because I keep feeling I catch a tiny bit of a phrase sometimes, and I feel like I'm supposed to understand it, but I don't actually.
Right. Like you're in Poland, you hear somebody talking, and feel like, wait, are they sending me to get tested? What's going on?
Yes.
Right. Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night. Thanks again.
So who is this? Who is this guy?